and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
I remember the day in September 1932, I talked with an audience of farmers about the farm problem. I gave them my pledge that if I were called to serve in the White House, I would take the lead in action to reverse the process of agricultural decay which had been eating at our national foundations for many years. And I have sought consistently and constantly to keep that pledge. We decided that as a nation, we would no longer promote commerce and industry at the expense of agriculture. We decided that as a nation, we would abandon the policy of rural neglect.
This neglect was rooted in the belief that rural electrification should be a private endeavor. However, the private electric utilities pricing model and rates were too expensive and acted as a barrier to rural electrification. Not until FDR became president and created the Rural Electrification Administration did this barrier begin to crumble. FDR and REA, bringing light and power to rural America. America lagged behind in providing electricity to its farms when compared to other countries. By 1935, several countries had rates of rural electrification ranging from 75 to 100%. In all of these countries, government aid was given to cooperatives, public plants, or private agencies to electrify farms. Meanwhile, in the United States, only 10% of American farms had electricity. The private electric companies' requirements for rural electrification could only be met by large-scale, prosperous farmers. Farmers were required to pay for installation of power lines as well as a monthly payment to guarantee a profit to the company. These charges were in addition to usage rates, which varied widely. While families in the city had electricity to power lights, running water, washing machines, and kitchen appliances, families in the country did not have any of these modern necessities. Instead, countless hours were spent washing clothes, cleaning and filling kerosene lanterns, pumping water, chopping wood, and working the farm. On March 4, 1933, FDR became the 32nd President of the United States with the Great Depression in full swing. FDR began rolling out his New Deal to stimulate the economy through programs such as the CWA, the PWA, and the WPA. Not everyone was a fan of his alphabet soup, most notably businesses and private enterprises. The American farmers, however, knew they had an advocate for rural improvement, including electrification. FDR's first step was to establish the Tennessee Valley Authority in May 1933. The TVA was a model of a new type of federal agency that both supplied and regulated power to a very economically depressed area. With the success of the TVA, FDR had a proven model to use to electrify farms. In 1938, FDR gave a speech in Barnesville, Georgia, in which he described making this town his home 14 years prior when he was in search of a pool of warm water to help treat the crippling effects of polio. He would keep this home the rest of his days. There was only one discordant note in that first day when the first bill came in for electric light for my little cottage. I found that the charge was 18 cents per kilowatt hour, about 4 times as much as I paid in Hyde Park, New York. That started my long study of proper utility charges and the subject of getting electricity into farm homes. So it can be said that a little cottage at Warm Springs, Georgia was the birthplace of the Rural Electrification Administration. On May 11, 1935, FDR created the REA by an executive order. This was the first step in breaking the barrier to rural electrification.
You get power at cost. When the loan from the government to your cooperative is paid back through your electric bills, you and your neighbors will own your own electric system, your own lines.
REA served as a lending agency with $100 million to be given out as loans to electrify farms. Preference was given to public bodies and nonprofit organizations, but private utilities were also eligible. At first, the private electric industry publicly supported the REA, but 6 months later they chose not to participate. Instead, they began a rigorous opposition campaign. When farmers began forming co-ops and applying for REA loans, private utilities increased their opposition. They infiltrated towns where farmers were organizing and passed out pamphlets with misinformation and published false advertisements in local newspapers. This did not stop the farmers from forming co-ops, nor did it hamper the success of the REA. On May 20th, 1936, Congress passed a bill extending the life of the REA for 10 years with an annual allotment of $40 million. Although FDR and the REA began to break the barrier to rural electrification, the battle was just beginning, often fought in court as private utility companies used the legal system when their opposition campaigns were unsuccessful. Since there were not always laws that applied to electric co-ops, if state or local officials were sympathetic to private companies over the REA, court battles would ensue. In 1934, all U.S. governors were asked to pass a bill to remove the barriers to REA projects. However, only a few states followed through. So in 1937, Congress passed the Rural Electrification Cooperative Act, which freed REA co-ops from state commissions, regulations, and put an end to court battles.
Many years ago, I was told by men of experience in state and national affairs that American farmers could never agree on a program. I did not share that pessimistic belief. My friends and I went out to disprove it, and the farmers of America showed clearly that we were right. To them go the honor and the glory.
REA created a demand for equipment and appliances. They had a team of engineers to redesign transformers, conductors, meters, and worked with manufacturers to bring down the price to allow more farmers to afford electrification. Before the REA, private industry cited the cost for building rural lines as $1,500 to $3,000 per mile. By 1940, the REA had driven this cost down to $500 to $900 per mile. From 1935 to 1940, more than 1 million farms were electrified, which helped to ease the burden on wives and children on the farm as their husbands went off to war.
In the midst of a world at war, we find that the foreign commerce we had managed to achieve is rudely disturbed, and all agriculture is certain to be seriously affected if our export markets disappear. So it is more than ever important for farmers to have a government in Washington that is looking out for their interests, not just by uttering glittering generalities, but by specific policies and concrete action.
REA projects contributed to the war effort as electrified farms helped to feed America and the troops. After World War II, FDR and the REA Post-War Planning Committee worked to electrify the remaining 3.5 million farms without power.
The National Farm Program is American democracy's response to agricultural distress. That farm program is a splendid example of what 6 million American families can do when they have the will and have the leadership to do it. The farmers have had a long, hard struggle to get laws and programs which give them an opportunity to obtain economic and social justice.
By the 1950s, close to 80% of rural America had light and power, and the power companies' opposition to REA finally subsided. Over 1,000 rural co-ops continue to provide electricity to over 5 million customers. Unfortunately, the rural neglect FDR fought to improve can again be seen across America.
One of the critical elements of using telemedicine is a stable broadband and internet connectivity. Do we always have that in these rural communities?
So it is kind of a patchwork around the country, and we do definitely need to spend a lot of time and resources, much like we did in the 30s and such with rural electrification.
Before the panic, was anything being done on the federal level to address the rural healthcare crisis?
We've had a lot of senators and representatives that have joined us in this fight. Unfortunately, these are systemic inequities that have been built into the system for decades, and it's really hard.
Addressing systemic inequities and rural neglect is hard, but necessary and possible. FDR provided the vision, leadership, and resources necessary to create a rural electrical infrastructure. REA served a market that the private companies had chosen to ignore by empowering rural Americans with the means to free themselves of economic and social restraints. The barriers to electric and power for rural America have been broken. Can we do the same for other rural needs, such as access to broadband and healthcare? Or will the farms, once again, be left in the dark?